Dear colleagues and friends, thank you for joining our discussion on this snowy morning. As far as I understand, today's discussion is one of the few this year that will focus on the international agenda, on a very broad agenda to boot. And specifically, it will focus on the Asia-Pacific region and the Asia-Pacific challenges. The topic that we plan to discuss today has brought together a well-represented team of panelists with very seasoned speakers, remarkable personalities. And I do hope that our today's discussion will be captivating. Why is this issue on the agenda at all? I do not think anyone has reasonable doubt to believe that today's situation is not emphatically underlined by the Asian advance. And the way that Asian nations will meet global challenges and the pace that they would keep moving onwards will certainly render an impact on the world economy as a whole. There are so many changes which are ongoing, internal and external, and multilateral changes which merit our attention. The advantages of developing countries and emerging economies, like low production costs and cheap labor, are no longer a systemic factor that would prop up their high economic growth rate. And the growth rates have dwindled. Having said that, they are advancing at a steady pace, and this is indicative of possibly new factors of growth. So we no longer can be talking about developed and developing economies. The digital age has bracketed everyone together. And those countries which have been considered to be developing for many years now boast most advanced, most sophisticated technologies which leave other traditionally developed nations far behind. I suggest that we take a look at several strata of global competition, primarily economy, domestic development, goals and objectives, opportunities for development, opportunities which are used and ignored. Secondly, let's take a look at the current status of global competition, economic competition first and foremost. And how do various nations use new opportunities, new trade environment, new cooperation principles? Some countries have shaped up new ideologies which are a far cry of what they used to propose before. And finally, why don't we take a look at Russia's position in this new environment of global competition? And what are opportunities and hindrances for Russia? Let me give the floor first to Arturo Pris, who is a well-known economist from IMD of Switzerland and the author of the so-called competitiveness rankings. As far as I understand, you rank different nations in terms of their competitiveness. I gather that Asian countries are also included in your ratings, but they do not include the traditional mainland China, but Hong Kong and Singapore.
What is your attitude towards these competitiveness rankings? I hope everything was okay with English translation or not, okay? So good, great. So Arturo, please give us your insight on the vision, what place Asian economies do take in global economy and global competitiveness rankings. And so what can be better or less, okay?
Thank you, Natalia. Thank you. Good morning. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak in such a distinguished panel and also to be the first one to speak. If you take Asia as an economic continent, let me start by the obvious, and I think that we will debate that definitely here today, is that it is difficult to consider Asia as a region, economically speaking. It is definitely very diverse in countries and economies. Our world competitiveness ranking itself speaks by the numbers. I mean, if you look at our rankings where we look at 63 countries, you have the typical small economies on the top, very competitive, Hong Kong, for example, being the most competitive economy in our list, but also Singapore, Taiwan, Malaysia, and then you have the countries in the very bottom, very uncompetitive. And competitive in the sense of prosperity generators, not just from the pure perspective of competition. Then you have the Philippines, Indonesia, India, which are very, very far away from the good countries. And then you have all this big bulk of economies in Asia, including China, that includes Thailand, South Korea, but also Japan, which are in the middle of our table for different reasons. In the case of Japan, because of the size of the public sector. In the case of China, because of the institutional policies and the lack of social development. So Asia is not a region. And I think that when you talk about the challenges of the region for the future, I have listed a few, but let me mention the ones that I think most important. To me, the most important challenge of Asia today is that if you look at the past 1,000 years of history and how empires and economic regions succeed, it's always done through economic, political, and social cohesion. And we have very good examples of economic cohesion, for example, in Europe or in the Western world, that explains why Europe has dominated the world economy for more than 500 years. Now, if you look at what happens in Asia today, it's to me shocking, and I travel a lot in that region. It's very shocking what happens. There was a Pew survey that was conducted a couple of years ago, where they asked different nations, who do they think they are the enemy? So, for example, the Americans said that their enemy is Russia. Russians said that their enemy is the US. If you ask Britain, in Britain they will tell you that their enemy is China. And in Spain, we don't say that our enemy is France. We say that our enemy is actually Russia as well, for whatever reason. Now, if you go to Asia, you just need to travel around. The South Koreans hate the Japanese hate the Chinese hate the Indians hate the Pakistanis, the Malaysians hate the Thai hate the Cambodians, and so on. So there is a lack of. No, it's not. It's actually. But let me give you another proof. Now English is our lingua franca in Europe, and it has been so for decades. If you go to the Middle East, they have their own lingua franca. It's a natural economic region because they all speak Arabic. Now, it surprises me that Asia, being so dominant in the economy, has not managed to agree on a lingua franca. You could say that Mandarin should be lingua franca just by the numbers, but I don't think it will ever be accepted. And it's not just about the difficulty of learning, it's just that there are social constraints to that. So to me, one very important barrier that Asia has to circumvent is how to truly generate cohesion. Because what we see today is we see competition much more than collaboration in certain aspects. And obviously, that's also the reason why Asia is not by itself a natural currency region, as Europe is. And the euro has been extended naturally to the east. Naturally, I say, but because culturally and socially, we all participate in the European Song Contest, okay? And and at the end of the day, we play Champions League in football. So that's to me the most important challenge for Asia, which is very, very broad and explain why the economies are so different. I will mention then two more for the sake of time. And I think it was mentioned in the first introductory panel that I attended. Asia has a severe productivity challenge, both in the levels and in the increases. The world economy is going through a massive stagnation of productivity. This is especially true in the West, but what is happening in Asia is that there are several countries, and here I will leave China aside, but if you go to Thailand or Malaysia or Taiwan, I think these economies are struggling at competing by finding value-added sectors. Okay, the largest exporter of shrimp in the world is Thailand, but the largest exporter of processed shrimp in the world is the Netherlands, which is surprising. And the reason is that all the shrimps that are fished in Thai waters are sold to Netherlands companies that then process, create value added, and export them. So I think one of the challenges for Asia how to bring value added to their industry, especially in those countries. And the third challenge that I want to mention is infrastructure. I mean, China is probably over-investing. At least someone would say that it's over-investing. But the recent estimate by the Asian Development Bank say that Asia will need $1.7 trillion investments in infrastructure annually for the next 10 years. And we in our center claim that there are two pillars to building a competitive economy. One is talent and education. And obviously Asia has made extraordinary effort there, and relatively speaking is very well positioned, not only in talent and education in general, but especially in digital talent, where countries like China are making a lot of progress. But the second pillar of competitiveness in the very long term is infrastructure. So failing countries, I'm thinking here Brazil, for example, are those countries that do not invest in infrastructure. And how to manage those investments and how to make sure that those investments in infrastructure are truly value increasing is also a big challenge for those economies. Okay. I could talk about debt, I could talk about the environment, but I will leave it here.
Great. Thank you, Arturo. Probably I will immediately would like to give a word to our distinguished speaker from China, декан и основатель ведущей бизнес-школы Китая, CKGSB, Professor Xian Bin. What is your attitude? What is your placing of China in global rankings? And what is the way forward for China?
I hope I know what I'm talking about. I flew from Hong Kong. I cannot bring enough warm clothes because the fever and cough.
You just, yeah. Push red button. Yeah. Okay.
I share with you my three observations. I'll start with China. Now to move into what I call a Confucian economic bloc. That means, China and Greater China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Macau, Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Vietnam. These societies fundamentally shaped by Confucianism. So despite these political diversities of the regions, the economies, the countries, and there's some common cultural element, which is Confucianism. And then I do a simple comparison of China, India. And so this is my 3 cents. China economically, I think, continue to do well. And firstly, China is really cutting edge in technology now. All the technology disruptions, including artificial intelligence, robotic technology.
Could you speak up, please?
Yeah.
Oh,
Is it good enough?
Could you give us a big microphone?
Yeah, is this okay? Yes, okay.
Sorry.
So China really cutting edge in terms of technology now, in terms of amount of investment in each of these key areas. Yeah. And in particular, the internet application. In many areas, China is already ahead of the US. You go to our headquarters in Beijing, and in many of the restaurants downstairs, they do not accept the cash or credit cards. Only Alipay, WeChat. You scan, you go. And then you just no cash, no credit card. Just so easy. And then So this is one reason. Second one is, the consumption boom has come. And in the past, China was a center for low-cost manufacturing. Since 2008, China contributed about 30% of global economic growth. For many companies, if you missed out China, you missed out. So China all of a sudden becomes so attractive because the market itself, So that will continue for coming decade, despite the aging population problem. And thirdly, and this new wave of urbanization will continue at least for a decade. And fourthly, the neoliberalism, as started by Ms. Thatcher in 1979, and actually has a lot of miles left. Now, for the U.S., I think every sector has been deregulated. President Trump used the tax cuts, which is more like a last straw. But China, we have like 7 sectors monopolized by the state-owned enterprises. We have about 30-some sectors, predominantly state-owned enterprises. China can easily generate growth opportunities by new round of deregulation. We don't need to innovate to generate growth opportunities. So there's, Chinese students are a large source of foreign students for any major country. For U.S., 1/3. For UK, over 1/3. Australia, over 1/3. And so there's many reasons to be optimistic. For this Confucian economic sphere or block, I followed this since year 2000. 2016, the combined nominal GDP was 19 trillion US dollars, which is bigger than US, number one now, and then EU. So that's the reason I'm positive. Despite a great diversity of political systems, you look at mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, look at Singapore, look at Korea and Japan. We have very different political systems. But economically, we have been doing well, for many maybe cultural reasons. So for the future, I remain to be optimistic. The third point is about China-India. Actually, in 1978, and China-India's GDP roughly the same, if you go by World Bank data. Last year, or 2016, China's GDP about 5 times that of India. And then to me, the critical difference between China and India, every time there's a change of prime minister, the West tend to place a lot of hope on India to catch up with China, even to outperform China. Every time so far failed. To me, the critical difference between China and India is the fact in China we have far more source of disruptions than what you see in India. Look at India, 30 richest family, over 30 richest family. You don't have a BAT. Look at what happened in China. Every 5-10 years, look at the top 10 richest people in China. There's a sea change. One wave after another. I look at global economy for the past 30-some years. I think a key driver for economic growth is this source of disruptions. U.S. did well because U.S. using technology and business model disruption, even some of the financial disruptions, But in China, we have all of that on top of many more sources of disruptions. So China did well. Those are my 3 cents. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. And today we also have 2 very distinguished and experienced China watchers who are Jonathan Femby and Frank Pick. I would really like you to comment. Somehow it turned out that the main question of today's discussion is China in the 21st century. And as far as I know, Jonathan, you have published in the end of last year a book, Will China Dominate the 21st Century? And informally, I guess, what is the answer for this question? If you could comment, and we'll be grateful.
Well, you won't need to read the book. So in English, the answer is 2 letters next to each other in the middle of the alphabet, N and O. There, partly because nobody can dominate the century, and this book is partly a reply to a series of books and interventions saying that China the 21st century would belong to China? And the simple answer is nobody, I think, can dominate this century, because we are in a fragmented world. We've probably always been in a fragmented world. I just finished a book about 1947-48, and it's amazing looking back then, the extent to which the world was moving in different ways, in different fragmentations. But that's one reason. And also because I don't think China particularly wants to dominate the world. I'll come to that in a minute. And also because I would argue that the political system in China, despite what the professor just said, is going to actually hold back the economic and social evolution of China in the years to come. And if I could just say a few words about China specifically itself today and where it finds itself. I mean, I agree entirely with what you were saying at the beginning. We have this concept of Asia as a place, but actually it's probably never been a unified region at all, and it is very different. And even within the Confucian Asia, there are many, many different economies, societies, political systems, and so on. Confucianism, if I dare say so, is always a very good blanket to put over a lot of things, but it means different things to a lot of people. You can find almost anything you like in Confucius if you look hard enough there. But just briefly to speak about China. I think we are going through, have been going through, and are going through, and will be going through a very important evolution in the development of the People's Republic. And this is largely due to the system and the way of governing that we've seen with Xi Jinping over the last 5 years, and at least for 5 more years to come, and it may go on beyond that. And this has both above all domestic implications for China, which I'll speak on briefly, but those have international implications too. Domestically, and I know Frank will speak more about this in a moment, we've seen, to my mind, a great strengthening of the power of the Communist Party as the central organizing force in China, which, because of economic reform, had become somewhat weakened in its control, because the Deng Xiaoping model, to be very shorthand, was to devolve a lot of central authority to regional actors and to other actors in the economy. And that, under Hu Jintao, between 2002 and 2012 particularly, produced a weakening of central control and central power, both in central provincial terms and in terms of vested interest groups, the state-owned enterprises, the People's Liberation Army, and so on. And Xi Jinping, as he made clear since taking power at the end of 2012, wants to re-centralize power, and has gone a very, very long way towards doing that in the last 5 years. This has involved strengthening the Communist Party, partly through the famous anti-corruption campaign, but also in taking over for the Central Communist Party responsibility for areas of government which were previously left to the government. This includes foreign affairs and includes the economy, which is now basically decided by a Communist Party leading group. So you have in China this power center, which I believe in Russia is not there, or certainly not as powerful, power center of the Communist Party, 70 years old, 70 years in power now, which Xi has identified himself with as the personal leader, and which is his thoughts written into the constitution at the last party congress in October, means we have this elision of the party, its leader, and the nation, which gives you a real power base, which I don't think any other ruler on earth has at the moment. And looking outside China, Xi has clearly decided that it's time to get away from the old Deng Xiaoping model of China, which was summed up by the phrase, hide your brilliance and bide your time. In other words, don't frighten the rest of the world, while we need cooperation with the rest of the world in order to develop. wait until the moment comes. And clearly Xi Jinping thinks the time has come. So we have him making 14 state visits abroad a year, spreading himself across the world. We have the big initiatives like the One Belt, One Road, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Silk Road schemes, other schemes, and so on. We have him appearing at Davos a year ago as the champion of globalization, of open trade, and of fighting climate change, even though those don't always refer very well back to the reality in China. And in a sense, I think the world, and China has made absolutely correctly from its point of view, has made the most of Xi as what you might call the non-Donald Trump. You know, the world wants to look for someone else, and China is there to play that role. And when Trump went to Beijing in November, it was almost as if it was the barbarian ruler arriving to pay tribute to the emperor in the Forbidden City. The pageantry, the whole mise en scène was absolutely perfect there. So China has engaged itself in the world, will be and will continue to be a major world actor. But at the same time, if you look domestically within China, the economy, although its evolution has been absolutely spectacular and the most important global event probably since the end of the Cold War, but there are still an awful lot of economic issues to be dealt with in China, starting with the debt mountain, starting with a lot of other inequalities, disparities, lack of healthcare, lack of education, things which Xi Jinping himself pointed to in his Congress speech, and which I think will be the main narrative of his second 5 years in power. So, yes, China is very big and very important, and by saying no in the answer to the question in the title of my book, I don't mean to diminish that at all, but I think we can almost overrate the influence of China on the world at the moment. How competitive it is something which we can come back to later, but also in looking at the web of, and I'm not being negative here at all, because this is, I think, the Chinese way of proceeding, and it's perfectly logical from China's point of view. But for instance, if you take the Belt and Road Initiative, this is often compared by journalists to the post-war American Marshall Plan. It's not. It's nothing like the Marshall Plan, because the Marshall Plan was to set up a cooperative economic and political organization among like-minded states, and by the way, led to the development of the European Union, which America was the most important actor in, probably. China doesn't act like that. China acts largely in bilateral deals, which are done across the world. It rides on existing institutions and processes quite reasonably and to its great success, but it doesn't want to be bound by those institutions and processes unless it chooses to be so. So there's a lot of working out of this relationship to take place, but I'm saying we have to look at China as it is today, rather than the China that we imagine it to be.
Thank you. I can stand from asking you one question immediately now. Is there anyone who can dominate the 21st century if China not?
No.
Okay, so the same. Thank you so much. Professor Pick, I know that you also have some guidelines for dealing with China. Some publication of yours, Knowing China, a 21st Century Guide. So we somehow also trying to find the answer for that question. So probably you will also give us your insight on this agenda. What is the China in the 21st century?
Right. Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's an honor and a privilege to be able to speak to you on my favorite subject, the Chinese Communist Party. In particular, I endorse almost everything the previous speaker has said, with a couple of...
That's very dangerous. We're meant to disagree.
I know. But don't worry, I will disagree with you on certain points. It will happen. But the main lines of your argument are absolutely correct. What I have here is not even a paper, but a thought piece written for myself on not so much the rise of China, but the rise of the Chinese Communist Party as a leading force in the world, which is something we still haven't quite wrapped our brains around, I think, because China, or the Chinese Communist Party, presents itself always as the leading force in Chinese society, Chinese politics. That is taken for granted. But because China is globalizing, the Chinese Communist Party is almost forced to follow that globalization itself in order to not so much keep it in check, but chart its course so that it continues to be aligned with what the Chinese Communist Party itself thinks the interests are of itself and of China. And that is actually a very difficult task. It's something that it's struggling to keep up with, and it's struggling to do. It's not that there is a master plan hatched in Beijing, which is then faithfully rolled out by all Chinese actors in concert across the world, but it's more a matter of having all kinds of stray animals running in all kinds of directions, individuals, universities, enterprises, even government institutions, even party institutions to a certain extent, and they have to be somehow be kept in check, or at least be charted in a particular direction. And that is what the Chinese Communist Party is struggling to do. So I would want to argue against a picture that is now being presented, particularly in the United States and in Australia, where many people are now saying, particularly of a more right-wing persuasion, of course, that the Chinese Communist Party is in fact already taken over the world, and if we don't take action now, it will be too late, and we will be living under the yoke of a communist dictatorship across the world. That's basically what is being said now, and that's, I think, a gross overstatement of some smidgens of evidence across the globe. By which I don't want to say that there's nothing going on. There's a lot going on, but it's not as evil and as dark as, for instance, the China Committee of Congress in Washington routinely now says. So in order to make sense of this, what China does in the world, there are essentially two different viewpoints of China, two different paradigms, two different conceptualizations. And I've called these the exceptionalist conceptualization and the mainstream conceptualization. I'll come back to that several times in my presentation here. The mainstreaming conceptualization essentially says that China is a normal country that is globalizing, is developing and is globalizing, and will become more like any other country in the world, and also will obey the normal laws of whatever these are, of political and economic development and evolution. And that's essentially also a globalization argument. So China is a main driver of globalization, but it's also beholden to, as it were, the laws and regularities that pertain to globalization. That's one picture. The other picture is that of an exceptionalist image of China, and that says that China is essentially different from any other country in the world. It's the only civilization in the world that can look the West straight in the eye and talk back. It is not even a country, it is, as I said, a civilization that has its own rules, has its own dynamic, and that's something we can't explain on the basis of normal political theories or normal ideas. And the point is that both these images of China exist both in the West and in China itself. So when you talk to Chinese, they constantly hop back and forth between these two arguments as well. The one hand they say, well, we're just a developing country and we're still very poor, and we will become a normal country and we will participate in the normal world order and la 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 la. But then they also say China is a great Confucian country, we have a different civilization, we have a different political system, and you have to take account of that, and we will not play by the rules of other countries, particularly rules imposed upon us. And you see the same argument also in the work, or not the work, in the speeches of Xi Jinping. And he, of course, is veering more and more towards the direction of an exceptionalist image of China. And he said this very, very clearly in his speech at the now famous or infamous 19th Party Congress, in which he said that the thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics in a new era, which is the slogan, the new slogan, which is his thought, makes clear that major country diplomacy with Chinese characteristics aims to foster a new type of international relations and build a community with a shared future for mankind. Now that sounds wonderful, a shared future for mankind. But then a few months later, at a conference that I attended myself, organized by the United Front Department of the Communist Party, he made another speech in which he said that the Belt and Road Initiative was the practice of the concept of a community with a shared future for mankind, i.e. that shared future of mankind is a Chinese future. And that is about as direct a statement of China's exceptionalist position in the world as I've ever heard coming out of China. Because Belt and Road doesn't mean anything, it means basically a Chinese way of dealing with international relations and international influence on Chinese terms, serving Chinese interests. That's all it means. Now, it is quite easy to look at China then from a perspective of in realist terms and say China is a big country, we have to face it head on, as other countries do. International relations is a zero-sum game, and we are now all prepared for a battle for world hegemony. And that is something that is almost something that people in Western countries, including even my own little small country, like to say, right? It feels good to say. They say, yeah, let's pick a fight, let's do it, come on. We've got an adversary, let's just take him on. But that, I think, is first of all extremely stupid, and secondly overrates China's influence. Or China's role in the world and what China wants to do in the world. And the previous speaker already said a few things about that. I mean, to a large extent, China's bullishness is now also very much a no-Trump card that is being played. We should also not forget that China is still an incomplete nation, and if you want to control China, there is no better strategy than raise the word Taiwan, or the word Tibet, or Xinjiang, or the South China Sea, or North Korea, or whatever other territorial conflict they still have in order to complete the nation, and they will get so distracted by that that they forget about other things in the world that perhaps matter more. And that is a time-honored strategy that I think is still very, very useful. I also want to endorse what Jonathan Fenby said about the fact that China will not dominate the world because the world has become a different place. The 21st century is no longer a world that is suited to great power strategies like in the 20th century, and China is not the only rising power. In fact, China's time may have run out quicker than we think. When you look at demographic developments in China, for instance, there is a natural limit to the spectacular growth of China's economy, and thereby also of its power in the longer term, of another 10 to 15 years. And then other countries must step into the breach. Countries like India, Turkey, the other rising powers. So China will, by definition, play a game in a multipolar world. And the important thing is that it knows that. It is prepared for that. It knows that the world is multipower. That's not just jargon. That's not just a slogan. They really believe that that is the case. And in that sense, they are a different power than the United States that still falls back into this superpower discourse, just like Russia does to a certain extent, and to my mind also to its detriment. So now back to, I don't know how much time I have.
Yeah.
Okay. So now back to the issue of the Chinese Communist Party. When you look at the Chinese Communist Party, it looks like this incredibly strong, well-organized, well-oiled political machine, and to a certain extent it is. And in fact, its restructuring, strengthening, and build-up has in fact been going on for at least 20 years, if not more. It does not date, and there I disagree with Jonathan Fenby, it do not date from the Xi Jinping area, but the first attempts and policies and measures to strengthen the party as such date from the mid-1990s. And it has been gaining momentum ever since, but most importantly in 2004, and again, of course, then with Xi Jinping's rise. So it is very much part of the strengthening of the Communist Party, is very much part of the discourse about the second stage of reforms that started officially in 1992. And Xi is simply amplifying that discourse, is strengthening it and bringing it to its logical conclusion. Now, when you look at the Chinese Communist Party, it says it's a leading organization in China, and that means many things, but the important thing is that that leading role is now also extending abroad. That's the point I started out this presentation with. So what is it doing in order to try to rein in sometimes, or coordinate, or have control over what Chinese actors do abroad? First of all, it plays a leading role, and has been playing a leading role forever, basically, in coordinating foreign policy. So the role of the leading group for foreign policy of the Chinese Communist Party is now much stronger than it was in the past, but it's a continuation, a strengthening of an existing institution or an existing role, rather than something fundamentally new. The Chinese government, as such, is always been, not only in foreign policy, but in all kinds of policy domains, is always been just one chess piece on the chessboard on which the Chinese Communist Party plays. And the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for instance, has no power whatsoever. It doesn't make any policy. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is not even in the Politburo. He is that unimportant. So coordination of conventional foreign policy, but that also extends to foreign trade, investment, and all the rest. That's one policy area that is coordinated as in a joint-up exercise. Yeah. 1 minute. Okay. Then the Communist Party is extending its visibility and direct actions abroad. For instance, the United Front Department, the Chinese Communist Party Central Party School, and all kinds of other organizations are now much more proactively visible abroad in helping, for instance, restructure public administrations through teaching programs, through exchanges, and even through direct aid in friendly countries like Fiji, for instance, or Sudan, or the Congo. I mean, not the leading countries in the world, but it's a first and a very, very important step. Also, Serbia is part of that small group of countries, and that is just an indication of what is to come. These leaders of these countries talk unabashedly about a China model, by which they talk both about economics and about governance, administration. They don't talk about democracy so much, of course, when they say that. There's many other things going on, very highly publicized events of the Chinese Communist Party sending up party cells, or we should call them committees, or branches, of course, abroad. These are aimed mainly at Chinese, trying to coordinate and trying to get them ideologically in line. There's a lot to do about the internet, which I won't go into. Now, what should we do? And I need 1 minute for that, if you don't mind. The natural tendency for us is to say that the Chinese Communist Party is going out there, is doing stuff, is trying to roll back Western influence, and basically we're playing a losing game against this gigantic political machine. I think that would be grossly overstating the power of the Communist Party, despite Xi Jinping's efforts to strengthen the party and centralize, in particular, that's the most important, to centralize the party. The party is not even in control of China itself. If you know anything about Chinese governance and government and politics, then you know that the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese government and the Chinese political system in general are extremely fragmented, along functional lines. It's highly decentralized, so local governments have huge power, and increasingly also there are business empires of also political leaders that infuse a financial and economic dimension to competition for political power. So the Chinese Communist Party itself is not united, and that same fragmentation also plays out abroad in the strategies of foreign firms and other actors abroad. So they march to their own tune, and they only will march to the tune of the Communist Party if they're forced to do so. They can do that through a campaign. It can perhaps the coordination can happen for a few months or a year or 2 years, but eventually they will move away again and start pursuing their own interest. And that is something that we abroad should not only be aware of, but also make use of, because we're not dealing with China, we're dealing with a multiplicity of actors, and some of the most important competition for the Communist Party abroad will in fact be Chinese.
Thank you for your position, and I guess we have a very provocative, and we've seen quite polar views on China. That is gives us opportunity to discuss it, to understand. I would say that both opinions or both positions are very traditional, and we know about it. But probably my question and my intervention in this case will be. Professor Pick, you talk mostly about Communist Party, and at the same time, if we look at China, it's not the Communist Party which goes abroad. It's big Chinese companies like Alibaba and many others. And I guess most young generation, they never heard anything about Communist Party. They know Alibaba, they buy with Alibaba, they do economy with Alibaba, and that's what is China for them. If you don't mind, maybe I will ask also Professor Xiang if you have some words to comment on the previous opinions or to continue discussion, because in my point of view, China worldwide is a big business doing big digital economy, and it's not about purely communist influence or something of that kind. Professor Xiang.
Well, I teach a 3-day seminar on Chinese model of economic development to my Chinese audience. The Chinese experience is so difficult to understand, despite the fact that I've been 20, 30 years student of that. Look at China. We carry the flag socialism, but we practice capitalism to the limit. Look at China. We don't have anything that is socialistic. We don't have universal health care, which you have in Russia. We don't have free education. Our education system only covers the 9th grade. We don't have a universal pension system. Our Gini coefficient was 0.491 in year 2008, only second to Brazil. So you look at every measure. China succeeded because China has been probably the most capitalist country on earth. That's the problem for China. China succeeded. China's challenges all coming from that. To me, I think there's a possibility, and China, U.S., as the two major capitalist blocs putting too much pressure on Europe. That's where the problem is for global balance. Look at the political system in China. Definitely the party, this ruling party, so powerful. I mean, by far the most powerful organization in China. But there's so many Chinese that go abroad to study, they migrate to U.S. They can vote by faith if they don't like. They have a possibility of voting by faith now. And then the ruling party called CCP. But if you look at the way they're governing, they're more Confucianism than communism. For example, the best and brightest in my age group ended up in government. That is coming from Confucianism. That's coming from the very famous teaching from Confucius. The highest honor you can do to your community is to serve as government officer. I mean, whatever you do, your scholar, your military, whatever, next level play. And it emphasizes on experience. Look at Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping. You have to be a head of a commune, a county, a vice mayor, poorest area of China for 5-10 years, a rich area. Not like a President Trump. You just go there, give a speech, and then you go. So you have to be in this poorest area for many years. You're promoted rank by rank. This coming from Confucianism. That got nothing to do with communism. Okay, despite the fact called CCP, to me, I mean, they're more Confucianism. I'll give you more examples. Investing a lot of money on high potential, what they call the cadres, young high potential cadres. That coming from Confucianism. You look at the Leadership Academy in Pudong. Look at the instructors, speakers they invite from around the globe, first-rate facilities, speakers from around the globe. They're sending many of them to Nanyang Technology, Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew School Public Policy, National University of Singapore, Duke University, Kennedy School. Tell me that any ruling party doing anything like that. That got nothing to do with communism. That's Confucianism, emphasis on learning. So China is confusing to many, partly because sometimes we signal left in order to turn right, So that's the problem. Okay, that's my 2 remarks.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would actually strongly disagree with the point that China is ultra-capitalistic. I think quite the opposite. I think capitalism lies on 3 pillars, at least in my Economics 101. One is private property, you know, and we can discuss that. But the second one being perfect competition, which certainly does not exist and is not promoted by the government, quite the opposite. I mean, I think that what I see is that, especially the companies I work with, when they come to Europe for business education, they are in the banking sector, utilities, you know, ChemChina has recently bought Syngenta in Switzerland. These are all central monopolies sponsored by the government where competition is not allowed. I always wonder, for example, if in the banking industry, you know, you allow for competition in China, whether we should have the Chinese banks being the largest in the world. And finally, a basic ingredient of capitalism, which is indeed the reason why China is not competitive in our rankings, is rule of law. I think that free markets and stock markets do not guarantee capitalism. And we can call it Chinese-style capitalism, but it's certainly not capitalism.
China is a capitalist country in the sense that, yes, we have 7 sectors, SOE, 30-some sectors dominated by SOE. But look at the GDP of China, 70% coming from purely private sector, 80% of jobs, over 90% of new jobs. So China succeeded because of a combination of neoliberalism and state capitalism. I'm not saying China has no state capitalism, but fundamentally China's story is a classic capitalism story. It's entrepreneurship story, no different from a typical US story. Look at many of our students starting from scratch, making a brand, making a consumer good. When Jack Ma entered our class, he's not one of the top students in the class. Now he is. You know, they started from scratch. That's capitalistic. That's not from state-owned enterprises, okay? 70% of GDP of China come purely private, despite influence of Communist Party. You know, that's classic. And also, we don't have a lot of welfare. Look at the Gini coefficient, you know. I know what you mean, but to me, you look at these measures, I could consider China as capitalist as another country.
So,
Yeah, if I could just put it there. I think, I mean, this argument goes on, and you can find the words forever, you know. Certainly China isn't communist in the classic sense of communist. It's Leninist, which is a rather different matter. That's a political organization matter. It's not capitalist because, I mean, you have only to take examples of big companies. I mean, Dalian Wonder being the Wonder Group being a big example, Hanbang and so on. These are private companies, but when the state wants to rein them in or tell them what to do, it tells them what to do, and they obey. And I'd say even Alibaba, WeChat, Baidu, and all the others, yes, these are private companies in a sense, but they operate within a state, a ring drawn by the state, which, among other things, keeps foreign competitors out, which is extremely useful. And I don't think Jack Ma is going to do anything that discomforts Xi Jinping in the slightest.
Thank you for this discussion. And probably I would say that the current economic situation shows that economic theory lacks the proper definition for what is happening in China. So those definitions developed for capitalist, pure capitalist, ultra-capitalist, they're purely Western-oriented. And what we see in China is really something new, or which we still need to think over. Let's say probably it's like Confucian capitalism or something.
No, not only China, but globally, I think neoliberalism, you know, I think started by Ms. Thatcher and then followed by President Reagan and Mr. Deng Xiaoping. I think it has run its course. Issue is what's next, not only for China, what's for the US coming up. So globally, we don't have a solution. We don't have a formula. Not only issue for China, it's a global issue now. And this, with artificial intelligence, robotic technology, the cheap labor formula will not work for China anymore. And then, what does it mean for India? If if India would like to copy China's way, no longer possible. You know. So all of this, I think we're in the time of mega changes. You know, and not going to be the model for everyone. China does not have a model to me. You know, I want to make that clear. You know.
Thank you. Anyway, the development is much quicker than the definitions being developed by scientists and observers, I guess. And today we won't speak only about China as the representative of Confucian culture. In some sense, in Asia-Pacific, we have also other leaders or former leaders, which also in some sense represent the Confucian culture, probably, or probably not. So today we have Irina Tumonina, Dean of School of International Relations here in Academy of Presidential Academy. And she is a big expert on Japanese studies and on Japan. Ирина, прошу вас высказаться по роли и месту.
Irina, could you please comment on China? How special is that? And whether Japan is a Confucian economy. So what's your perspective of that? Thank you for this opportunity to speak. What you actually said in your introductory remarks is exactly what I was planning to talk about, with all due respect for the acute interest shown in China, India, and other rapidly developing economies. There is still one another nation which is a global economic player, that is Japan. What people say about the sunset over Europe, some people say the same about Japan, about the declining economic growth rates in Japan, and that is being shoved back in the second and third row in Asia. Okay, then. Now, I'd like to say a few words about what's going on in Japan these days and about its new stance in the Asian region. Well, the growth rates in Japan is not high at all. It is even below its neighboring countries in the region, which is pretty obvious. And the reason for the declined economic growth are clear, like the aging population and several others, objective reasons, which is the transition to post-industrial development pattern, like in many other highly developed nations. There are several other reasons which are closely linked to the global environment and the Asian environment. Strange as this may seem, Japan has lost its competitive edge in traditional high-tech industries. Well, this is a plain fact, and we have to recognize that. However, how come Japan has been sliding back to this secondary position? Back in the 60s and in the 70s of last year, Japan's capital was branching out to Asian markets as foreign direct investments to create production facilities in other Asian countries. So, in doing so, Japan fostered competition in other countries of the region. Chinese, Malaysian, and Indian economies started growing, and they capitalized on the production facilities and the production potential originated by Japan. I don't think I should be talking much about integration, but, well, there is a certain relationship here. Japan is known to be very cautious about multilateral cooperation. It used to build relations on a bilateral basis, and still, the Asian integration was based on those ramified production and industrial networks originated by the parent, advertently or not. And it was like a flock of flying geese, where Japan was copied originally. This model today is totally different if we recall the two engines, the two locomotives concept. So what is the outcome of this predicament in Japan? A person who's been looking at the Japanese economy for many years, I believe that we may cite Prime Minister Abe. I will become the best seller of infrastructural systems for Japanese companies, meaning that Japan offers to other countries in its new stance a solution, an infrastructural solution. In other words, major Asian economies are now developing as fully export-oriented economies. Today, well, as far as I understand, people are focused on all-inclusive growth, or they're focused on the domestic market, and they're very keen to invest in the domestic infrastructure. Of course, the Japanese companies will not be alone on that competitive market. However, the Japanese government is taking unprecedented effort to branch out to those markets and to promote and to ramify the pan-Asian infrastructure. I don't know whether colleagues would agree with me, but when I looked at the Asian Development Bank, I mentioned, I noticed that the pan-Asian infrastructure was a very trite phrase in the Asian Development Bank.
Now, about the role of Japan, I would like to share just one fact with you, because it's known as experts from the Asian Bank of the Development calculated out of 45 Asian countries, 92% are public investment, and the demand is high. So we are living in the environment of the fourth industrial revolution, and people have more spare time, and there is a demand in the quantity and quality of infrastructure. But the limitations are the opportunities of public investment, and international organizations and national governments vest high hopes into different investment funds and private-public partnerships. And in 2016, the Asian Fund for Infrastructure Investment was created with the initial capital of 1.5 billion US dollars, was provided by Japan as material aid. So I believe there are prospects in terms of innovative processes in trade, and there will be room for the search for some new relations and between this old economic power, Japan, and new countries which are trying to become leaders. I will not cover domination because Japan from 1930s, as far as I know, Japan rejected the idea of domination. So Japan keeps using its soft power. So actually, this is my contribution, and thank you so much. Thank you, Irina. I think now I will use the chance to give the floor over to Yaroslav Lisovolik, who is a chief economist in Eurasian Bank of Development. So let's move to the international agenda about integration, thanks to Irina. Yaroslav, the floor is yours. Thank you, Irina, and thanks to my colleagues, members of this discussion, for a very interesting conversation. And I'm really excited to hear some opposite points of view. And I felt that the definition that we lack a model is really true, that we lack some common approaches, not only in Asia, but in the global economy as such. And we should not just talk about the level of countries, but the level of regions in international integration. So, and this global integration is facing a challenging phase where we see contradictions between different regional projects in Asia, and we see some tensions between China and the United States of America, and we see similar problems in Eurasian space. And here we see the need for a certain coordination, especially it's important when, if we would look at what's going on behalf of developing and industrialized countries. So we see some signs that the economic policies are being delegated to regional level. So most of BRICS countries actually function in terms of their foreign economic policy in terms of regional groupings. And this is also the case of industrialized countries, especially European countries. So there is a need for coordination. And in one of my recent articles, I offered a concept of syndicated regionalism, which provides for that interaction between regional groupings at various levels and in different forms in terms of development banks and in form of creating uniform platforms for interaction between regional development banks. And there are such opportunities in place, both in the context of the Silk Way of this Chinese project of creating a consortia of development banks along the entire Silk Way route. And last year I was to Washington, D.C. and I spoke at a session with some distinguished representatives from different development banks, including the Asian Development Bank. And we heard that proposal regarding the need to strengthen coordination between development banks, and probably we could create a uniform structure for promoting regional banks. And also, last year, we heard the initiative from China to create BRICS Plus. And in some interpretation, that initiative on BRICS Plus can provide interaction between regional groupings where BRICS countries are the leaders. So in case of Russia, it's Eurasian community. In case of Brazil, it's Mercosur. In case of South Africa, it's the South African Customs Union. And at the global level, we can talk about the opportunities to create a special range of coordination between different regional projects for G20, where every country is a representative of a regional project, or also it could be coordinated at the level of the WTO. But anyway, regionalism is at the moment witnessing a new stage, and this is Asia is a vivid case where we see an aggregation of regional projects as part of mega-regional blocks. And there is a question of how they will interact, because we see a growth of potential dividends from mega-regionalism of that scale due to integration. But also there are risks, because if you don't have coordination, mega-regional projects of that scale, if there are contradictions, so these can lead to a number of risks. So how can Russia tackle these challenges? So first of all, I would like to highlight ASEAN. So ASEAN is very important as a region. So this is a grouping which lies at the crossroads of many cross-regional projects. And for Russia, it's really essential to understand how to structure integration process, the process of integrating with this region. So whether relations should be bilateral between certain countries, or the alternative way would be to create a block of countries focused on integration, or whether to integrate with all ASEAN countries, given that this is one of the fastest growing regions in the world with a growth rate above 5% per year. So it would probably be correct to see ASEAN as a priority of foreign policy and integration policy. So the second point, I believe it's important to develop a strategy regarding the largest countries in Asia, the three big countries, China, Japan, and Korea, and to think how Russia interacts with these countries. So in my opinion, there is a need for a competitive approach in order to benefit from the competition between these three big countries, which are struggling to get access to Russian mineral resources, especially in the Far East. So the Silk Way and the economic integration is also an important priority for Russia. For Russia and Eurasian country and Eurasian Economic Union, Silk Way is the possibility to get away from geographic countries. So 4 out of 5 Eurasian Union countries have no access to the sea routes, which causes problems with the economic turnover and commodity turnover. So the Chinese project, the Silk Way project, can be a project Eurasian countries can benefit from if investment flows between the East and the West are optimized. And as for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, it will still remain a challenge for Russia, for Asian countries, for other countries in the world, not in 1 or 2 years' time, but after 1 or 2 election cycles. So, and the answer, which was formulated as ASEAN plus Shanghai Cooperation Organization, so it was, which was formulated by Russia. So it's not quite adequate. ASEAN, of course, yes, but SCO is not that powerful at the moment. So an alternative could be BRICS Plus, which could coordinate major regional projects, in particular in Asia. And the last point, I believe that Russia has vaster opportunities in Asia, and we are just starting to develop them. So the level of how you can vary alliances in Asia is much wider compared to Europe, where you have just one economic bloc. And we need to be very particular in how we formulate our strategy for our alliances in Asia. Thank you. Yaroslav, thanks very much for that positive insight. As for the development banks, I never heard the word competition in your presentation. So I believe you support like a strategy of unification, although quite often you hear that traditional development banks are challenged and confronted by the newly emerged banks. So let's leave this question for now. However, for integration groupings and the existence of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is TPP-11, and Japan is one of the locomotions, the driver of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So now Tatiana Flagentova, the director of the Russian Center of APEC studies. Tatiana, I would like you to comment in terms of the existing integration processes and answer the key question of our today's session. Is it more about competition or a creative unification of everything? What do you think? Thank you, Natalia. I have prepared a presentation with trends on trade policy and the way how trade and investment in Asia-Pacific region are regulated. So I would like to go quickly through my main slides and to comment on what our colleagues already mentioned. So the main discussions were on how high is the chance of growth in trade, in commodities and services, and we see that the forecasts based on 9 months of the past year of WTO and UNCTAD, we see that in 2017 countries in Asia-Pacific region and in the world in general managed to achieve a growth. Regarding trade and services, we should mention that in the world there is a negative trend, but in Asia-Pacific region we can highlight a stable growth in trade and service. As for the structure of goods and services, we saw that services accounted for about 20% of gross indicators. But if we would talk in terms of an added value, it's even higher. It's about 45%. The next slide. So regarding regulating trade and investment for today, as we know, recently there is a great deal of regional agreements being developed which provide for preferential tariffs, and countries which are members of WTO have their obligations as part of the organizations. And the tools available for different national economies in terms of tariff regulation is restricted. However, everyone has to defend their own manufacturers, and measures countries use are not related to tariffs, and the agricultural sectors are the most defended in that, the most protected in that regard. As for the merchandise trade, we see that the role of phytosanitary measures is higher. So the main function of the measures is about regulations, but quite often they function as latent protectionisms and serve as barriers for foreign companies. So if in the first 2 slides we saw statistics for the world in general, and now let's also look at trends for the Asia-Pacific regions. And these trends of non-tariff limitations led to a revision of the trade policy, both in international organizations and the strategy reflected in the international agreements. So the current trade policy, which is far beyond the scope of what's being regulated by the WTO and regional associations, so which cover WTO plus provisions. So as for APEC, which is relevant for the Asia-Pacific region, so the agenda is far beyond from what's within the scope of WTO and the access for the internal regulations. So it's about investment and shaping bodies for dispute arbitration between the countries. And another relevant issue is e-commerce and international intellectual property protection, and also environment protection. The next point. So if we began our discussion about regional trade agreements, and we started to talk about regional trade agreements, so if earlier in the 90s we saw a request, a demand for free trade zones and areas, but in recent years the qualitative growth was mitigated to a large extent due to a move to the system of regional trade agreements for that spaghetti bowl, as we said. And also in recent years, please, could you have a look at my next slide? You see this structure, which should have been developed in recent years, but there were a number of shocks. First of all, related to the fact that the first decision of President Donald Trump was to leave the Trans-Pacific Cooperation. So the United States were behind the ideology of this Trans-Pacific Cooperation, and they were leading regions in their attempt to liberalize their legislations to get access to the North American market. So once the United States left the agreement, the need became urgent to transform the TPP agreement. So in late October, early November 2017, so we saw the comprehensive attitude to the agreement. So the ideologist was Japan, which ratified it, and also the New Zealand ratified the new version of the TPP. So as part of the negotiations, some major provisions of the TPP were reviewed, and also some advanced provisions were frozen regarding that dispute settling body and trade sanctions on developing countries if they violate rules on protecting rules of the workers. And a lot of provisions on IP protections were frozen and deleted.
And that concerns the pharmaceutical sector in particular. It was believed that this agreement was to be signed earlier. However, this agreement has never been signed due to the non-show of Canada. Now, we are hopeful that this will be finalized during the meeting in Chile. However, Canada and several other TPP members have a few reservations about the draft agreements. A similar predicament is evident in another, the comprehensive Asian economic partnership, which includes Japan and China. Over the past several years, the negotiations stumbled over the liberalization of the services sector and some tariff provisions. India and other members raised these issues year on year, and the hopes that some consensus would be achieved have been thwarted. There's outstanding issues remain outstanding. Well, there is little hope that this agreement will have been endorsed by all parties this year, 2018. Well, all these issues are aggravated by the not-so-successful WTO conference last November in Buenos Aires. So here's the picture. On the one hand, we can see that some forecasts over the trade regulations do not come true. On the other hand, some regional WTO agreements are falling short of expectations. Some fair trade movements are gaining momentum, and the public believes that some of the proposed global changes are non-transparent and they do not benefit all. and that these proposed agreements campaign for the interests of the big business, whereas small and medium-sized businesses are given a blind eye. If we expect regional processes to further evolve, we can visualize several scenarios. First, there will be bilateral initiatives taking ground. And I believe that President Trump's policies is largely based on bilateral approaches. I believe that both China and Japan are in favor of bilateral approaches. However, this may aggravate the spaghetti bowl issue. On the other hand, it is possible that the already endorsed agreements will be revised. And so how they should be revised, if at all, is a complex issue. It is based on the specific consumer interests or manufacturers' interests, and this will require greater work and painstaking efforts than a major overall global agreements. The trade agenda is getting larger. Non-tariff barriers and new issues, investment issues, trade investment issues are included in the agenda of regional agreements and regional meetings, and they should be included in the WTO and the Asia-Pacific Council meetings. It would be difficult to quickly achieve a consensus within the WTO framework. On the other hand, we believe that the WTO should still remain at the foundation of the world trade. However, regional associations and organizations are better positioned to achieve a breakthrough in the negotiation process and achieve agreement quicker. In this sense, I would uphold Yaroslav Lisavolek in his proposal to support the segregated or interblock communications or interregional initiatives and organizations. These initiatives should be more transparent and more publicized in order to gain ground and gain popularity. I further believe that after they get approval at a regional level, they may be elevated to the fully international level, and that may be a better and more efficient approach. This is probably all I wanted to mention, and I also wanted, as a by comment, I wanted to mention when it comes to e-commerce and digital economy, they have become very popular items on various agendas. Yeah, we can see that e-commerce is gaining ground, and with a major locomotive for that growth being Asian countries. However, I would suggest we may want to discuss and further expound on this. E-commerce is a driver for the digital economy as a whole. From the United States perspective, that would favor the liberalization of e-commerce. On the other hand, Russia and others believe that the digital economy is a tool for resolving a number of social issues, so they must be inclusive. So, the digital economy and e-commerce receives various perspectives, and we believe that this concept may be interpreted in different ways. And this brings about this issue. Most countries in the Asia-Pacific region have endorsed a number of laws to protect intellectual rights and consumer protection. However, there is no comprehensive program that would be relevant or applicable to e-commerce. This is still in the pipeline. On the other hand, there is no global agenda for the digital economy or e-commerce regulation. And we should probably identify a balance between the interests of large businesses and small businesses to benefit from the e-commerce and digital economy on the one hand, and to make use of this digital economy to benefit the needs of society as a whole. Other adjacent issues are national security and the use of e-cash. However, on the one hand, this will help promote competition and the competitive edge of manufacturers. On the other hand, this may be detrimental to national security. So it is a very, very difficult issue to find a proper balance between them all.
Input to our discussion, and I think that the question which Tatiana concluded her intervention with was about digital economy. I guess most of our speakers today talked about digital economy as a key issue in international economic cooperation and in domestic economic development, and it's really a big issue whether attitude and regulation of this digital agenda is a topic for common understanding. In my point of view, it is not. So Tatiana already said that, for example, United States, they're for opening the borders for liberalization of digital economy. At the same time, we know that China didn't join the electronic commerce initiative within WTO. So all economists understand that domestically it's very important. At the same time, internationally, there is no common understanding. I know that you have digital competitiveness rating this year with the AMD. So what is the results? What did you evaluate it? And what are your current understanding of this situation? Arturo, my question.
Difficult to summarize, but essentially what we try to assess is that to what extent countries are well positioned to embrace digital transformation. And I think it builds in three pillars. One is talent and digital talent. I think in that dimension, certainly Russia is well positioned, as well as the entire Asian continent. So talent and investment in education. Second is the digital technology, where of course, for example, China is certainly dominating the world. And third is, as you said, is attitude, both at the personal and at the business level. And I think both are very important. Business agility, which for example is lacking in Russia in our index, but is also lacking somehow in Asia. And also personal attitude. May I give you one example because I think that's important. In Switzerland, the country where I come from, is a country that excels in digital business transformation, where companies embrace digital transformation, but at the same time, individuals are very reluctant to adopt technology. In Switzerland, you're going to go to a branch when you visit a bank, or you're going to see your insurance broker. So I think attitudes are extremely important. That's how we try to assess the digital competitiveness of a country or a region. I would add, in my opinion, and I think it's also something from what we have been discussing, a very important point, which is regulation. And having a digital-friendly regulation is going to be extremely relevant. Today, if you look at, for example, fintech sandboxes around the world, which is basically the regulatory environment that promotes financial innovation and fintech financial technologies, you have in Europe, you have the Netherlands, the UK, and Switzerland. There is no sandbox in the United States because Donald Trump blocked that initiative, but all countries in Asia, including for Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, they all have fintech sandboxes. So pioneer and led by China, I strongly believe that Asia is going to lead the fintech revolution. There are some countries in Europe that will follow, but certainly it's going to be I think it's going to be a quick win for many countries to implement the right regulation, because talent is difficult to change. Infrastructure takes time to build, but the attitudes are difficult to change. But regulation is very easy to implement.
But I wonder, is it a secret who is on the top of your rating in digital competitiveness?
Not surprisingly, Singapore.
Okay.
But I say not surprisingly because things are very easy to do in very small countries, especially if it's a dictatorship. So small dictators then they have an easy life, you know. So Singapore is our leader in digital transformation, but at the same time it's not the example, as I always say, because it's difficult to replicate the Singaporean model.
Okay. Do other speakers are ready to comment on this digital issue of?
Well, definitely China will come out really strong. Look at the experience of this young generation entrepreneurs. Like we work with Tencent. We set up 1 or 2 classes a year. And then we would Baidu, you know, and then JD.com, another leading internet-based company. So we have this group usually average 30 years old. Many of what they call unicorn companies, you know, and the valuation as high as 12 or 16 billion US dollar, young people. So I see a flood of disruptions coming up in China. That's the hope for China. 30 years old, so many of them, you know. So whatever this BAT, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, if China stuck with the 3 major internet-based companies, China has no hope. I want to see a new wave of BATs coming out in the next 5, 10 years or so, and they will. They're coming, very strong. Yes.
I think the other thing in China is that the state, the party state, has embraced the new technology as a very useful political social weapon to itself. So, you know, it's behind the operation and the game there, and you can see the whole social credit scheme and so on. That is big data, new technology, but not for commerce. This is for internal political control, the registration, together with visual recognition techniques. So that serves a political purpose, definitely. And so long as the private operators, as I said, behave themselves, they will develop within that ring. The question is, what happens when they go outside? And here there was a question mentioned of national security. And you can see that with Huawei in the US at the moment, and the increasing concern about the internationalization of what are basically state-driven internet operations.
Yeah, I'm not a specialist at all, but some of my colleagues in Leiden are. And one of the things that I constantly hear is that when you look at it from a Chinese perspective, it's not simply about control, it's not simply about the state, not simply about the party, but it's also about what you could call cyber sovereignty. So China very strongly believes, and it's a very hard argument to counter, that the internet is also a place where you want, as a state or as a nation, exercise sovereignty to a certain extent. And what you see is that the Chinese government and government players are very interested in international negotiations and cooperation in terms of governing the internet, but not with the idea that a fully free and open internet is necessarily what you aspire to at all costs. So they want to have some kind of guarantees that their own interests are being served. That also means that as China becomes more and more dominant in through these companies that you just mentioned, in both the hardware and the software of the internet and the social media, that China is increasingly in a position to set the terms of internet regulation also abroad. And that is something that you see very clearly, particularly in more developing countries. Now that is perhaps a danger, something we should be aware of and try to defend ourselves against, but it's also something that may be a sign of the times to come. Other countries may want to do the same thing, and also, to a certain extent, it is not unreasonable that China says we want to have an internet that works according to the principles that we endorse, that we believe in. And that's more than simply a dictatorship saying, I want to use it for my own repressive purposes. There's also commercial arguments behind it, which is really very important, because the big internet companies are, of course, American, and China has been very successful, I think, in simply playing a long game of trying to domesticate these companies through the weapon of entry to the domestic market in China. And you see them one by one falling into line. So I think the internet is going to be a Chinese one to a certain extent, but that's not necessarily meant, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be an instrument simply of dictatorial repression at all.
Thank you. Irina. Yeah.
So, with your permission, I would like to say a couple of words, not just about Japan, but about digital economy. So, regarding agenda Tatiana mentioned, so I think it was more about the need for an international regulation of e-commerce, because digital economy is far more complex. As for regulating, it's different in different countries. It's different in US. It's like more about the Internet of Things. So in Germany, it's more about cyber intellect. So e-commerce is the top of the iceberg. So we cannot say what types of prescriptions or recipes are possible for different countries. We don't know yet. But of course, as for regulating e-commerce, it's our reality. It's a political weapon, and I heard a lot of exciting things about China, and the context is, of course, important. And I would like Tatiana to probably say a couple of more words on that. Please be brief, if possible.
Thank you for your question and for your comment, and I absolutely agree that e-commerce is just on the surface of all this regulation, and it's much deeper and it's more vast than just e-commerce. And about the global or regional regulation, definitely is very complicated task, but it has been addressed in some international fora, in particular APEC, where I'm personally working for. So there was a digital economy roadmap, which was agreed by 21 APEC economies this year, and it was endorsed by our ministers and leaders. And it covers a vast range of different issues, starting from the physical infrastructure, from interoperability of regulation, and finalizing with the e-commerce, digital trade liberalization issues. And I'm absolutely agree with you that there are different ways of understanding of digital economy or internet economy, for example, in China, in the countries of the region. But as far as we understand that digital economy is the way to enhance competitiveness of our economies in general, so or international trade or international economic cooperation, there is definitely a need to make these systems talk to each other. So the need to make the system and regulatory system kind of interoperable to facilitate the international cooperation. I'm pretty sure that it's a hard task and it should be addressed in several years, but definitely the work should be done and should be started from the common definitions. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you so very much.
To Irina's position, I won't agree with you fully that it's too early to regulate or to think about digital economy, because even 20 years ago, no one knew what is cell phone. And today it's like a natural part of everyone's life. If you don't start thinking about it now, the markets of the future are absolutely developed due to and within the digital economic rules. And so we understand that most, especially, I guess, Asian countries are very keen on regulating and understanding and putting their rules within these new future markets. So probably digitalization could be named as one of the key challenges, probably Asian challenge, which is the topic of our today's discussion. And the answer to this question will give the answer to the many other questions of the future of the region. It's probably my personal opinion. And now we already out of the time, I guess, yes? So probably we do not have time for the question from the audience. But I welcome everyone to write to the Gaidar Forum organizers, and they will translate your questions to the speakers. I'm really very thankful for this fruitful and very interesting and provocative discussion. I understand that we didn't give any answers to any question raised in the beginning, but still we made at least one step forward, understanding each other and Asian reality. Thank you, everyone, and see you again.